The card had been placed at the far end of the table, against the wall, between the draught from the servants' passage and an arrangement of hothouse lilies so tall that no one seated behind them could be seen from the head. Cecily noticed it the moment the footman led her through the double doors of Ashmore Park's dining room. Her name in Lady Ashmore's handwriting, small and precise on a folded square of white card, positioned at the corner where the table turned and the light from the chandeliers did not quite reach. She sat down without remark. She unfolded her napkin. She noted that the candle nearest her was a half-inch stub already burning toward its end, that the glass before her had a small chip at the rim, and that Reverend Phelps, the elderly vicar invited as a courtesy to the neighborhood, had been placed at her left. He was squinting at the menu card as though the letters had been printed in a font designed to punish old eyes. She had been placed, in other words, in the corner reserved for people who were not expected to require anything. The room itself was saturated. Lady Ashmore had spent the fortnight before the house party in a state of logistical calculation that left no surface of Ashmore Park unaddressed, with fresh candles to the last socket, hothouse roses in the entrance hall, a consignment of mice and china unpacked from the attic and arranged with the heraldic crest facing outward. The long tables seated 24, and every place between the head and the corner where Cecily sat had been arranged with an eye to spectacle. Miss Frederica Ashmore, Lady Ashmore's daughter, 22 years old, and possessed of all the accomplishments a mother's ambition and a generous allowance could produce, occupied the seat immediately to the right of where the head of the table would be placed. Her gown was ivory silk, with a satin trim. Her pearls were the ones her grandmother had brought from France. She looked, as her mother had intended, precisely like someone who had been born to sit in that chair. The dinner party was 12 days into a fortnight's house party, assembled for one purpose that no one named aloud. Gareth Davenport, Earl of Summerfield, had been invited, and every arrangement in the house was addressed to the fact of his attendance. He was 32 years old, master of Summerfield Hall and its 9,000 acres in Wiltshire, and he had been a widower for 3 years. The ton had watched him since his wife's death, with the particular attention reserved for men of rank who have not yet remarried. Lady Ashmore had watched him longer than most, and her calculations were patient ones. Cecily had arrived at Ashmore Park 6 weeks prior to the house party, which was not invitation, so much as logistics. Her father, the Reverend Edmund Vane, had died in February. He had left a library of theological texts, a wren's nest of debts, too small to be dignified and too large to be ignored, a parish living that reverted to the bishop's appointment upon his death, and a daughter who had nowhere particular to go. The Ashmores were distant relations by marriage, a connection so attenuated that it required explanation, and a small chart to diagram. Lady Ashmore had written, with the offer of a room and board, and had framed it as charity in the way that left the recipient unable to mistake the frame. Cecily had accepted because she was 24 years old, and the alternatives were governess positions she had not yet secured, and rooms in Bath she could not yet afford, and the particular loneliness of having no household to belong to in the months immediately after one's father's death. She had understood within the week that her role at Ashmore Park was to be present without requiring anything. She mended the linen without being asked. She read to Lady Ashmore's elderly mother on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She gave Frederica assistance with her Italian, which Frederica received as a tutor's service rather than a cousin's generosity. She ate what was placed in front of her, and expressed gratitude for all of it, and said nothing about the fact that her room faced north and the chimney smoked. Gareth arrived at the dining room at 20 minutes past the hour, which was late enough to be noticed and quiet enough to suggest he had not considered that it might be. He was dark-haired, not tall in the manner of men who require attention, paid to their height, but still in the manner of a man who has learned that stillness costs him nothing. His evening coat was dark blue, his cravat white, his expression level. He moved through the room's greetings with the practiced containment of someone who had learned long ago how to cross a social distance without diminishing it. Lady Ashmore received him with warmth, calibrated precisely to the 9,000 acres. Frederica inclined her head at the angle her mother had taught her. He took the head of the table. He glanced once around the room in the way a man takes account of a space he has entered, and his gaze moved across the length of the table, past the floral arrangements, past the faces turned toward him with varying degrees of expectation, and settled for a moment on the corner where the candle was burning low and the lilies blocked the view. On Cecily's face. Not warmly, not with recognition, with the particular attention of a man who has noticed something he had not expected to find and has not yet decided what to do with the noticing. She looked back at him. She did not look away first. It was not defiance. It was simply the habit of a woman who had nothing to gain by performing modesty she did not feel. After a moment, he turned to respond to something the colonel at his left had said, and Cecily picked up her glass. The chip was on the left side. She turned it and drank from the right. The dinner was 6 courses and lasted nearly 2 hours. Cecily ate steadily and spoke when spoken to, which was not often, and listened to Reverend Phelps describe the restoration of a medieval font in his church, in terms that suggested the font was the only object in England worth caring about. She found, to her own faint surprise, that she did not entirely disagree. She answered his questions about her father with the brevity of someone who has practiced the reduction of grief into manageable sentences. She did not look toward the head of the table, not more than twice. If anyone had asked her that evening whether the Earl of Summerfield had noticed her existence, she would have said no, and believed it. She would have been wrong. The house party had 12 guests in residence and a rotating attendance at the dinner table that swelled the number to 20 some evenings. Cecily had been present at the table each night, and each night the card with her name had appeared in the same location, against the wall, in the corner, between the draught and the lilies, as though her placement were a fixed truth about the nature of things, rather than a decision Lady Ashmore made each afternoon when she compiled the seating chart at her writing desk. In the morning, Cecily walked the grounds before breakfast, when the lawn was still gray with dew, and the September air carried the smell of turned earth from the home farm. She had learned which paths avoided the kitchen garden, where the groundsmen began their work early, and which paths led down to the lake where the willows were losing their first leaves to the autumn, and the water was the color of pewter at that hour. She carried a book, more often than not. She read while she walked, which was a habit she had learned from her father, and which had given her, over the course of her life, a faint, permanent awareness of where the ground was uneven that made the practice safer than it looked. It was on the 3rd morning of the 2nd week, on the path between the lake and the walled garden, that she heard footsteps behind her and did not look up from the page, because she had learned that looking up encouraged conversation, and she had not yet finished the paragraph. "Miss Vane." She looked up then. The Earl of Summerfield was walking the path from the direction of the stables, dressed for riding in a coat that showed dust at the hem, his hat in his hand. He had, she realized, walked some distance to arrive at this specific path, which was not the direct route from the stables to the house. She noted this, and then set the notation aside because she did not know what to do with it. "My lord," she said. He fell into step beside her, which she had not invited, and which she did not appear to consider requiring an invitation. He did not speak for a moment. The path was narrow enough that the distance between them was closer than propriety strictly required, and she was aware of it in the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room, not with alarm, but with a precision that went slightly beyond ordinary attention. "Your father was a clergyman." He said he was. "You are reading Hooker." She glanced at the book in her hand, which was indeed Richard Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, in a volume her father had annotated so extensively in the margins that the book had become partly his own work by accumulation. "I am reading my father's notes," she said. He agreed with Hooker about 80% of the time. The remaining 20% is rather more interesting. He looked at her then, not at the book, at her face. What did he disagree with? She told him. It took 3 sentences. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, in the way a room changes when a window is opened, and then closed again quickly, and only visible in retrospect. "You're not what I expected," he said, and then said nothing further, and they walked in silence until the path reached the house. She thought about it afterward and could not determine whether it was a compliment or a categorization. She told herself it did not matter and believed it imperfectly. The third evening of the house party, the fourth course had already been served when Reverend Phelps found himself squinting at the menu card again, holding it at various distances as though the ideal focal length might yet be discovered. The card was elaborately printed in the French manner, and the candlelight at their end of the table made the script swim. Cecily set down her fork, leaned slightly toward him, and read him the remaining courses in a voice low enough to serve only him. He thanked her with the relief of a man who has been too proud to ask and too confused to manage without. She picked up her fork again at the head of the table. She did not know that the Earl of Summerfield had gone still. She did not know that he had been watching her end of the table since the first course, in the unfocused way of a man whose attention has drifted somewhere. He has not given it permission to go. She did not know that he had seen her set the fork down, that he had clocked the duration of her quiet assistance, that he had registered the precision with which she made Reverend Phelps feel unremarked upon while also met. She knew none of this. She would not have trusted it if she had. It was Lady Ashmore who named the conclusion before any other character in this story had arrived at it. She had been observing from the other end of the table with the particular focus of a woman whose plans require careful monitoring. After dinner, when the ladies withdrew, she drew Frederica aside in the corridor and said in the soft voice she used for instructions she considered important, "You must be brighter at the table tomorrow." "He was distracted this evening?" Frederica asked, with a slight lift of her chin where his attention had gone. "She is nothing but our poor relation," Lady Ashmore said, "and she should remember it." She said it with a certainty that was not quite displeasure, and was not quite concern. The certainty of a woman who has never found a seating chart to be an insufficient instrument of social management. "Arrange yourself accordingly." Frederica had nodded, and the matter had seemed settled, and Lady Ashmore had moved into the drawing room with the composure of someone who does not consider the possibility that the instrument might be inadequate to the task. Over the days that followed, the Earl did nothing that could be named. He asked no one to dance, there being no dancing at the house party. He paid no distinguishable particular attention to Cecily at the dinner table, seated as she was behind the lilies and below the salt. He did not seek her out in the drawing room where Frederica played the pianoforte and the Colonel told stories and the vicar dozed. He did not cross any line that could be crossed in evidence. What he did was this. On the fourth morning, a footman appeared at Cecily's end of the dinner table with a fresh candle. Properly sized, properly set, adequate for the light. Cecily had not asked for it. The footman offered no explanation. She glanced toward the head of the table and found the Earl of Summerfield in conversation with the Colonel, not looking at her. On the fifth morning she was reading in the library when Clive Ashmore, Lady Ashmore's son, who was 26 years old and possessed of his mother's capacity for social management, with none of her skill at concealing it, came in and made a remark. He was kind in the manner of men who consider that kindness diminishes the recipient. He said something about the expense of the house party, and something about how generously his mother had arranged everything, and something that began with the phrase, "A woman in your position." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The sentence knew where it was going. The Earl of Summerfield came into the library 3 minutes later, looking for a particular volume on Wiltshire agricultural history. He said good morning to them both, extracted the volume from the shelf with the practiced efficiency of a man who knows where his books are, and then asked Clive Ashmore a question about the Northfield drainage that required Clive to stop being in a library in order to answer it properly. They left together. Clive did not return. Cecily sat with the book open in her lap and acknowledged, with some precision, that the Earl of Summerfield had cleared a room of Clive Ashmore on her behalf without doing anything that could be named as such. She did not know what to do with this, and set it in the same internal space where she had placed the question of the footman and the candle and the walk on the garden path. The space was getting crowded. She tried not to look at it directly. It was the evening of the 6th day that she found herself in the music room alone, which was not an accident. She had gone there deliberately, At 9 in the evening, when the rest of the house party was in the drawing room at cards, because she needed the specific relief of a piano and 40 minutes without the requirement to perform gratitude. She had taken the small book from her reticule, the vocal score for Handel's Messiah in the edition her father had carried for 30 years. The cover was worn through at the spine. The corners were soft with use. There were no annotations in the margins, because her father had believed the Handel needed no assistance. She propped it on the music stand and played the opening chorus softly, the way one does when playing for oneself in a borrowed room at night. She did not hear him come in. She heard the door, though, when it did not close behind him. And she stopped and turned and found the Earl of Summerfield standing at the threshold with his hands still on the door frame. He was in his evening clothes still, which meant he had come from the drawing room. He had not come in. He was standing in the doorway as though uncertain of his welcome, which she had not previously associated with him as an expression. "Forgive me," he said. "I heard the piano. I should not have intruded." "It is your host's piano," she said. "You are entitled to enter any room in this house." He came in. He did not sit down. He stood at a distance that was correct, and slightly too specific to be entirely natural, and looked at the score on the stand. He said, "I have not heard that piece in some time. My father loved it," she said. He said it was the only music that asked you to think and feel simultaneously, rather than choosing one. He was quiet for a moment. The candles in the room were low and the light was warm and slightly uneven, and he was standing in the shadow between two of them, which made his face harder to read than it already was. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. He seemed to consider whether to continue, and then decided to, "My wife played, in the evenings. I did not come to listen often enough because I told myself there would be more evenings." He said it without self-pity, in the flat way of someone reporting a fact they have already spent considerable time with. She died in February of 1817. In childbed, the child as well. He looked at the score on the stand. I learned subsequently that she had been afraid and had not told me, because I had not made it easy to be told difficult things. Cecily said nothing. She understood that he was not asking her to respond, and that the right response was to receive the information without flinching. He looked at her then. "Your father died in February. As well, he did the same month." He was not making a comparison. He was noting a coincidence with the same attention he brought to everything. What did he die of? His heart. Very quickly. He was reading at his desk, and then he was not. She paused. I was glad of the quickness. He would not have borne incapacity. "Well, no," he said. "I do not imagine he would have." He looked at the score again. He extended one hand and touched the corner of it, not opening it, simply placing one finger on the worn edge of the binding, as though confirming something. "He has left his mark on this," he said. "He has left his mark on most things I own," she said. "It is the greatest inheritance he had to give." He looked at her over the score for a moment, and she felt the warmth come into her face in the way it did sometimes without her consent, the flush at her throat and at her wrists, the awareness that the room was smaller than she had thought it was when she entered it. She held herself steady. She thought of the chip at the rim of the glass, and the way she had simply turned it. He said good night, and left, and she sat at the piano for several minutes without playing, because her hands had stopped making sense as instruments, and were simply her hands. She did not name what she felt. She had learned not to name things that had no reliable future. The 7th day of the house party brought a change in weather, and a change in the quality of Lady Ashmore's attention. The morning was gray, with a rain that came in from the west and kept the party indoors, and Lady Ashmore used the constraint productively. She arranged a card party in the morning room, a reading in the library after luncheon, and a dinner that was the most deliberate of the fortnight. 30 guests, including neighbors, the full length of the table filled. Cicely's card appeared in the corner. The lilies had been replenished. The 9th course of dinner, Cecily was speaking with Reverend Phelps about the medieval font again, and the conversation had moved pleasantly forward, with the ease of two people who do not require performance from each other, when she became aware that the conversation at the head of the table had shifted in its quality. Lady Ashmore's voice had risen half a register, which was the register she used when she was pleased with herself. "It arrived this morning from Mr. Pritchard in London," Lady Ashmore was saying. "I thought it only right to share it, as it concerns a matter of some general interest to the household." She was holding a letter. Cecily recognized the handwriting on the visible fold of it, because it was the handwriting of her father's former solicitor, a man who had been winding up the estate since March, and whose correspondence Cecily had read in a series of careful, joyless sessions at Lady Ashmore's writing desk. "It seems," Lady Ashmore said, laying the letter open beside her plate and reading from it with the air of a woman who has prepared this passage, "that our young guest has been something of a secret industry. Prostoni." She read a portion of the letter. The relevant line concerned an arrangement by which Miss Cecily Vane had, over the preceding 18 months, given music instruction to 3 pupils in the village of Hatherley for a sum per quarter that the solicitor had noted as part of his account of her income and resources. It was a factual line in a factual letter. It was accurate. Lady Ashmore read it with the inflection of someone reading the verdict of a court. The table was quiet for a moment. Not politely quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a social fact lands, and the room waits to see who will be the first to confirm its meaning. Clive Ashmore said from his position midway down the table, "Well, a poor relation who teaches music for coin. Can we really pretend otherwise?" He said it with the smile of a man who believes he has said something that needed saying. Frederica Ashmore looked at her plate. Her expression was not triumphant, precisely, but it was the expression of someone who recognizes that the field has been cleared in her direction. Cecily set down her fork. She had been looking at the table when the letter was read, and she had continued looking at the table during Clive's remark, and now she raised her eyes and found that most of the 30 faces in the room were looking at her, with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity, to the polite avoidance of those who had decided to study their wine glasses. She found the Earl of Somerfield's face at the head of the table and read it for 1 second. His jaw was set. His eyes were on Clive. His expression had not moved, but his stillness had a quality she had not seen in it before. A compression. She looked away from him. She folded her napkin. She said to Lady Ashmore, "You will excuse me." And she rose from the corner of the table and walked the length of the room to the door, and she walked as she always walked, steadily, without haste, without the trembling she could feel in the backs of her knees. In the corridor outside she heard Lady Ashmore's voice behind her say just audibly to a neighbor at her right, "The poor relation has ideas above her corner, I fear." The neighbor made a soft sound of assent. Cecily walked to the music room and closed the door. She did not cry. She was not inclined to weeping as a first response to difficulty, which was a quality her father had called self-possession, and which she sometimes suspected was simply the inability to locate the exit in time. She sat at the piano bench, without opening it, and pressed her hands flat against the closed lid, and breathed. She thought about what she had, the clothes in her trunk, which were hers, the Handel score, which was her father's, and therefore hers, the 3 letters of recommendation she had written in the past month, and posted to 3 households in need of governesses. She thought about London, which she had enough money for if she was careful, and Bath, which she might prefer and could manage on the income from lessons if she could establish herself quickly enough. She thought about the specific quality of silence in a room one has not chosen. She thought about leaving in the morning before breakfast, which was the only dignity the situation seemed to permit. After a time, she found herself opening the piano. She found herself setting the Handel score on the stand and playing, not softly this time, but at the volume the piece required, the chorus, filling the room and the corridor beyond it. She was not performing. She was doing the thing she knew how to do in the room she was in, because to do it quietly on this particular evening would have been a capitulation she was not prepared to make. She played for 30 minutes. She was not aware of how long it had been until she heard the door. She turned and found the Earl of Somerfield in the doorway. He had left the dinner table. She noted this with a precision that she immediately set aside as irrelevant to anything she intended to do. "You should go back," she said. "It will be remarked." "It has already been remarked," he said. He came in and closed the door and did not sit down. He stood at a distance of several feet and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was attention entirely unguarded. She said with more evenness than she had expected to find, "I intend to leave tomorrow morning. I will write to Lady Ashmore tonight. I will not make a scene of it, and I will ask no one to make a scene on my behalf." She paused. "I want to be clear about that," he said. "What you want is to be treated as a person of worth. What I want," she said, "is to not be produced as evidence at someone's dinner table." She set her hands in her lap. "Those are not quite the same thing, though." "They are related." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the handle score on the stand. "Do not leave in the morning," he said. It was not a request exactly. It was not an order. It was the register he used for things he had decided were necessary. She said, "My lord, I have no reason to stay." He looked at her then, and she felt the full weight of his attention land, in a way it had not before, or had not allowed her to recognize before, direct and specific and unambiguous. "I know that," he said. "I am asking you to give me until tomorrow evening." She looked at him for a moment and said nothing. His expression was level. His jaw was set at the angle she had noticed at the table. His hands were still at his sides. She had learned over the preceding days to read the quality of his stillness, and what she read in this particular stillness was not command but something considerably less comfortable. "Until tomorrow evening," she said. He said good night and left, and she sat at the piano for a long time after. Not playing, with her hands still and the Handel score open on the stand, and the candles burning lower in their sockets. She did not sleep easily. She did not leave before breakfast. She went down at the usual hour and ate what was placed before her and said what was required, and watched the day move through its ordinary arrangements with a quality of attention she recognized as apprehension, arranged to look like calm. Lady Ashmore was at her most composed at luncheon, which Cecily had come to understand as the sign of a woman who believes the work is done. The dinner that evening was 32 guests, the largest of the fortnight. Lady Ashmore had arranged it with the particular satisfaction of a final movement. The flowers and candles and seating chart all disposed as she intended, the corner at the end of the table furnished with a fresh card bearing Cecily's name. Frederica in ivory, again, at the right of the head. The table laid with precision, the season's verdict rendered in white cards and hothouse flowers. The guests assembled in the hall and were shown toward the dining room in the established order. Cecily waited near the back of the group. She had dressed with care, which was a thing she had decided that morning, choosing her best gown, which was a pale gray silk that had been her mother's and had been taken in and retrimmed until it fitted well. The trim, not fashionable but correct, the fabric real silk, and not cotton. She had dressed with care because she was still in this house until tomorrow morning, and she would not be the only person in the room who knew it. She was not the last to enter the dining room. The Earl of Somerfield was. He came through the double doors ahead of Lady Ashmore, which was irregular, and he was not looking at Frederica's chair or at the head of the table. He was looking across the assembled guests with the specific attention of a man who has made a decision and is enacting it. He found Cecily near the far side of the room and walked to her, in the manner of a man who crosses rooms when he has somewhere to be, through the murmuring guests and the footmen with their trays, and the particular silence that fell in his wake. He stopped in front of her. Around them the room had gone quiet, in the way rooms go quiet, when everyone has realized that something is happening and no one yet knows what it is. Lady Ashmore's hand stilled on her fan. He said, addressing Lady Ashmore without looking at her, his voice level and carrying, "Miss Vane sits at my right. The table is hers." The room was completely still. Lady Ashmore said, "My lord, the seating has been arranged according to my plan. Rearrange it," he said. She said nothing further. Her hand was still on the fan. Her eyes moved to Frederica, who stood very straight in her ivory gown, and looked at the candles on the table with a composure that Cecily recognized as the composure of a young woman who had been trained for precisely this kind of correction and would survive it. Clive Ashmore made a sound. It was not quite a word. No one responded to it. Reverend Phelps, who had been standing near the fireplace and had seen all of it, allowed himself a small, satisfied nod, which no one in the room chose to observe except Cecily, who was the only person looking at him. The Earl of Summerfield offered his arm. Cecily looked at it for a moment. The dark blue sleeve, the gloved hand, the offer made in front of 32 people in a dining room that had been arranged to exclude her. She thought of the corner of the table. She thought of the card with her name in Lady Ashmore's handwriting. She thought of the chip at the rim of the glass. She placed her hand on his arm. He led her to the head of the table. He seated her at his right, which was the place that Lady Ashmore had spent a fortnight arranging. The place that determined precedence. The place that named her the first woman in the room in his estimation. And he did it without ceremony, with the quiet efficiency of a man conducting the most natural thing. He sat at the head. The footmen began to rearrange the cards. Lady Ashmore took a seat farther down the table. Frederica sat, and the ivory gown was there and present and quietly displaced. The room resumed its settling movement, guests finding new positions, the murmur returning, and above the murmur, the particular sound of 32 people recalibrating their understanding of who was present in the room and what she was. Cecily sat at the right of the Earl of Summerfield, and unfolded her napkin, and felt the warmth of the chandeliers on her face, and the warmth of the room, and the warmth of something she was not yet ready to name, and she did not look at Lady Ashmore, and she did not look at the corner of the table where her card had been placed. She looked at the man seated to her left, who was looking at her with the specific quality of attention she had spent a week misidentifying. She said, very quietly, "You have made rather a large gesture." "Yes," he said. "I have been told I do things too quietly." She looked at him for a moment. The light caught the set of his jaw, and the steadiness of his eyes, and the small involuntary relaxation at the corner of his mouth that she recognized as the thing he used instead of a smile. "You must give me time," she said. "I have time," he said. "I have a great deal of time. I have made rather a large gesture, and I intend to give you all the time in the world." "That is not what I meant." "I know what you meant," he said. "And I mean both things." She looked at him for another moment, and then looked at the table, the long, beautiful table, with all its candles burning, and permitted herself, in the privacy of her own chest, something she had not permitted in a considerable while. The remaining courses of dinner were served. The wine was poured. Around them the house party recovered its conversation and its ease, and the corners of the room that had been watching returned to their own affairs. Clive Ashmore drank his wine and said nothing further. Lady Ashmore ate with the composure of a woman who intends to be composed about things she has not chosen, which was a composure Cecily could respect without enjoying. Frederica Ashmore, when the ladies withdrew after the final course, touched Cecily's arm briefly in the corridor and said, "He did not choose me." I think perhaps he never would have, which was the most honest thing Cecily had heard her say. She was not wrong. The fortnight formally concluded on the Saturday. The Earl of Summerfield spoke with his solicitor on the Friday afternoon. On the Saturday morning, before the carriages began to arrive, Cecily received a call in the morning room, where she had gone to write letters, from Mr. Bossaw. Hadley of Lincoln's Inn, who had ridden out from London and presented her with a document requiring her signature. The document concerned a matter of settlement and intention. It was formal and precise. And Mr. Hadley explained it with the calm of a man who has navigated these conversations before, and Cecily read every word of it, which he appeared to expect and appreciate, before she signed. The news moved through the house party in the way. News moves through a house party quickly and by indirection, so that by luncheon it was known, and by afternoon it was certain, and by the time the first carriages departed, it had acquired the quality of a thing everyone had known was coming, which is the dignity the world extends to foregone conclusions once they have been made official. Lady Ashmore said nothing to Cecily directly. She said something to the colonel which Cecily did not hear, and the colonel said something to his wife, and by the time the subject reached Reverend Phelps, it had been simplified, and he simply took Cecily's hand and held it for a moment and said, "Very good. Your father would have been pleased." She thought he was probably right. The remainder of the autumn was the autumn, with all its practical requirements. Cecily returned to the village of Hatherley once, briefly, and said goodbye to her 3 pupils with the gifts she had been able to manage. She wrote the letters that needed writing and received the letters that arrived. She spent a week at the house of the Earl of Summerfield's aunt in Bath, which was a requirement of propriety, and which she endured with the patience of someone who understands what requirements are for. The aunt, it transpired, was a woman of considerable precision and dry wit, who had known and liked Gareth's first wife, and who looked at Cecily over the tea table with an attention that was not hostile, but was undeniably thorough. On the 3rd day the aunt said, "You are not what I expected." Cecily said, "So I have been told." The aunt permitted herself a brief expression that was nearly amusement. "He says the same thing," she said. "He says it about you, and he says it as a compliment. He says few things as compliments." She poured more tea. "I think you will do very well." Cecily arrived at Somerfield Hall on a Tuesday in late October. The drive was lined with beeches in their full autumn color, the leaves a shade of amber gold that was specific to that light at that hour in Wiltshire, and the hall itself rose at the end of the drive in grey stone, under a sky that had gone blue and cool after a morning of clouds. It was larger than she had imagined, and older than the Ashmore's house, and quieter, in a way that was not emptiness but settledness, a house that had stood long enough to have an opinion about itself. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, met her at the door. She was a compact woman of 60 or so, with a face that registered information quickly and disclosed it slowly, and she took Cecily's measure in the way housekeepers take the measure of a new mistress, not with judgment, but with the attention of someone who has managed a large house for a long time and intends to continue managing it. "Miss Vane," she said, "he told me to show you the music room first." Cecily looked at her. "He said you would want to know where it was before anything else." Mrs. Finch said with the composure of a woman reporting a fact she does not find surprising. "This way." The music room at Somerfield Hall faced east and caught the morning light. By. It was a long room with 3 windows and a ceiling high enough to give the sound room to move, and the piano at the far end was a Broadwood, in better repair than the one at Ashmore Park, tuned within recent memory. Beside the piano on a small table where it had evidently been placed with intention was the worn copy of the Handel score, the one she had left on the stand at Ashmore Park at the end of the last evening. She had not thought to take it. He had. She stood at the table and looked at it. She picked it up. The cover was still soft at the corners, the spine still worn through, the pages still dense with use. She set it on the music stand above the Broadwood's keys. She heard his footstep in the doorway. She did not turn around. "You brought it," she said. "It seemed to belong here," he said. She turned then and found him in the doorway of the music room at Somerfield Hall in the autumn light, with his hands at his sides and his face entirely open, in a way it had not been in the dining room at Ashmore Park, which was the manner of a man who has arrived somewhere and no longer requires concealment. "Cecily," he said, her name. In his voice the specific event she had been told it would be. She crossed the room to him. That evening, the household of Somerfield Hall dined together for the first time. It was a modest table, with Cecily and Gareth and Mrs. Finch in her capacity as a trusted fixture of the household, and Mr. Hadley, who had ridden out again on a matter of papers, and had been invited to stay. The table was set simply, without the elaborate formality of the Ashmore house party, the candles real and sufficient, and the glass unchipped. Gareth took his seat at the head and looked down the table toward the place that had been set at his right, and then at Cecily, who was standing at the chair, and she sat down. And the footman poured the wine. She set her hands on the edge of the table for a moment, and felt the solidity of it beneath her palms, the good old oak of it, the table that had been in this room since before either of them had been born, and would be in this room after them. She felt the warmth of the candles and the warmth of the room, and beside her the warmth of the man who had crossed a dining room in front of 32 people to offer her his arm. From the music room, very faintly she thought she could hear the echo of what she had played there on the first evening, though it was only the wind in the eaves and her own memory giving the wind a shape. Her father had believed the Handel asked you to think and feel simultaneously. She thought he had been right about that. She thought he had been right about a great many things, and she was glad of the 30 years of marginalia that had made his books, partly his own work and partly hers. She picked up her glass. The fire in the hearth settled behind her with a sound like approval, and the Wiltshire night pressed its quiet against the windows, and the Handel score on the music stand in the next room waited for morning. If Cecily's story has moved you, leave a word in the comments, and thank you for staying until the end.